In the last chapter, we mostly went over how Assassin's Creed was birthed from the idea of a sequel to Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. If you'd like more info on that there, you can check out the Chapter 0 video on that. As for a quick briefing on that, a recap if you will, Assassin's Creed started off life as Prince of Persia Assassins, and while Ubisoft loved the idea of it, they didn't think a Prince of Persia sequel without the prince as the main focus of it would do well, so they decided to make its own series, its own IP out of it. A bunch of the mechanics from Prince of Persia stayed: the wall running, the parkour. Some of the basics of the combat system stayed in place too. But notably, they did go with a more historical setting for the game compared to a more fantasy setting of Prince of Persia. Now, with all that out of the way, we can jump into how Assassin's Creed turned into the flagship for Ubisoft and created, quite frankly, the modern open world game as we know it. As I briefly touched on, they decided to go a more historical route for Assassin's Creed compared to the more Arabian Nights fantasy of the Prince of Persia games, because they thought they could bring more depth and realism to the game market. By this point in time, 2006, before the release of Assassin's Creed, when they were still working on the game and developing it, there weren't really any historical fiction games. While there were some games that were set in history, some of which were made by the History Channel, not many of them tried to take a more grounded approach into it. And while yes, Assassin's Creed is fantastical and whatnot, it is the world itself that is more believable than the more fiction aspect of the characters that you play as and interact with for the most part. Which is where one of the creators of Assassin's Creed steps in. I'm gonna probably butcher the guy's name because I don't speak French or French Canadian. Patrice Désilets. I'm probably just gonna slip up and call him Patrick because that's what it looks like when reading it. Alright. Now, Patrice was the creative director for the first Assassin's Creed game, and I do believe the second Assassin's Creed game, and also worked on Brotherhood and Revelations. He's the man that pretty much set the overall tone and overall need for it to be extremely accurate to history, right? This is the man that pretty much said, we're not going to have a crossbow in Assassin's Creed because it wasn't historic to the time at that point. So, this is the man that set the tone for Assassin's Creed and what would later come with it for the original games, so to speak. Now, to circle back to historical accuracy, right? They wanted there to be a crossbow in the Assassin's Creed franchise since before it was Assassin's Creed. In the early trailers for Prince of Persia Assassins, when the assassins jump on horseback, one of them pulls out a crossbow and uses it. So they intended for this aspect of the game to be in there from the beginning. Move ahead to the first Assassin's Creed trailer, which I'll toss up here. Altair uses a crossbow. They ultimately decided against it. One, because it wasn't entirely historically accurate to the setting of it being, let me look here, 1191 during the Third Crusade, right? On top of that, they also had concerns about using more ranged weapons for combat would trivialize stealth and maybe even limitations of the game engine. The last one there is a moot point when throwing knives were already introduced. They could have done the same style of, well, I guess the code could have been adapted to that. Just make it a longer range and a longer wind-up time. You know, needing to pull the crossbow back and lock it in place and put the bolt on it and all that, instead of just winding up the throw knife. So all of the pieces were there. It's just they went out of their way to remove a mechanic of the game people thought looked fucking awesome because it was not historically accurate enough. And that was mostly the doing of, from what I can tell, this Patrice guy. Although many will just argue nowadays that it wasn't put in due to game limitations, but we already covered that bit. Right. Now, as for the basic setting of Assassin's Creed, the first Assassin's Creed game, the historical part of it was set, as I said, in 1191 AD, during the Third Crusade. And people loved the idea of this because not only did they have what seemed to be the correct style of architecture, the correct style of clothing, maybe the streets were correct for the point in time in history, but also just the background speech that you would hear, much of which was just in a different language. Reason being, Altair would not have paid attention to this menial chatter along the street, so there's no need for the animus to translate it. Which brings us into the modern day section of the game, which is set in, I think, 2011? 2011 or 2012. It was the future when the first game came out. And by the third game, which is actually like the fifth game, it was present day. So that should ballpark how that works there. While on the topic of the animus, the pretty much fancy game system you use to go back in time, it was, even now, I say, a somewhat believable type of science fiction, right? Well, sure, you can't actually relive the genetic memories of your ancestors and see all that happy good shit. The way they explained it was, well, animals know how to fly the correct direction each summer and each winter because their ancestors did it, and the fish know which direction to spawn upriver and what rivers to get back to because their ancestors did it. So why can't people do the same thing, right? It's just a basic MacGuffin to allow for the rest of the story to be told, which is, quite frankly, amazing. Because I remember back when the first one came out, people arguing, kids my age, arguing on if it was real or possible or how cool it would be to actually have one. Last bit there, space facts here. 99% of people's ancestors, probably just farmers. And with that, we'll move into some of the gameplay mechanics of Assassin's Creed. The most notable thing everyone comes back to and what makes Assassin's Creed is the traversal mechanics of it. The parkour, the free running, whatever you want to call it. While Prince of Persia had a basic form of this for platforming, you can see how it inspired Assassin's Creed for what it was. Mind you, the Prince of Persia system only needed to be used to guide a character on rails through the platforming sections, while for Assassin's Creed, you needed to be able to move through a large open world. One of the main things they tried to nail down was to have it feel fluid. Like the character was picking up momentum, moving forward, stopping quickly but slowly enough to feel realistic, for the character Altair to have weight to him. Which, just having recently gone back through and replayed the Assassin's Creed games before Mirage came out, all of the Assassin's Creed games, mind you, yeah, the early games do have a weightiness to them that the more recent games do not. One of the more interesting things that they also introduced was, well, sure, you could run and hide in a haystack, which is pretty much a trope at this point. I think even The Witcher has made fun of that. One of the more ingenious things of it was to simply hide in plain sight, to blend in with those around you, so that you can get to where you need to go. And while in the first game, I do believe you could only blend in with the white-robed, hooded monks, it is, of course, expanded on later in games. Well, in later games. Was done away with for quite some time, and then recently brought back. It was one of the more unique mechanics that enabled you to try to solve the problems that the game threw at you in more interesting ways. Speaking of dealing with problems in unique ways, the combat system, which was actually a holdover from the Sands of Time, just more streamlined and made more modern by this point in time, a good 5-6 years later. It was yes, you could hack and slash, but the majority of the combat, especially that I remember, is counter-based. You hold your block button, someone attacks, hit your counter button, do an attack. Sometimes it'll damage them, sometimes it'll kill them. In later games, you can chain these together to have multiple knockouts or multiple kills to just make it all more fluid as you dispatch your enemies. The sword, the dagger, the hidden blade, all of these weapons could be used for that, with each one having a smaller counter window, but greater counter damage. I'm fairly sure the hidden blade is an insta-kill for counters, but it has the smallest window to do it. Now these are holdovers from Prince of Persia, because you could, while the game was mostly a hack and slash, don't get me wrong, you could block and then riposte or counter. You could do so with your sword, in which case you would slash and then leave them open for a follow-up slash after. Or you could counter with the dagger, which was an extremely short window to counter with that would instantly kill most opponents in the game. Also restocking your Sands of Time whilst doing it. So I think those two things show how Assassin's Creed is pretty much evolved from the overall idea of Prince of Persia. And finally, the setting of Assassin's Creed. Jerusalem, Damascus. When I first saw these places in game, I was astonished that you could climb up that big fucking building over there. That you see that random building in the distance over there? You can go to that. You can hang out on that place. You could do stuff there, right? For that point in time, 2007, right? It was pretty much unheard of to have a game like this. The setting was so structural. The historic setting was so structural to what this game was that I'd say it is most likely even more important than the overall story that the games tried to portray. Compare this to Prince of Persia, where I'm not even sure where most of those games take place. Again, Prince of Persia went for a more fantastical Arabian Nights kind of fiction, while Assassin's Creed is historical fiction. Now, don't get me wrong, the open world of Assassin's Creed did leave a lot to be desired. I remember reading that one of the developers had their son come in and playtest the game, and they found it as being extremely empty, devoid of most things that the game had. Because again, it was more a spiritual successor to Prince of Persia, so a more on-rails linear story, just with an open world to get to those points. When he said that the world was empty and it needed more stuff to do, they started adding in the little odds and ends that would become the busy work in later Assassin's Creed games. The eavesdropping missions, the collecting flags, the killing Templar captains, the I think pickpocket missions were in the first one. I know beat-em-up missions were in the first one. But they added all of these odds and ends into the game to flesh out the world, to give you more to do, to make it feel more alive. I don't really have a good segue for this next part, which is just like a quick overview of the story of Assassin's Creed up to this point, which it's the first game, so, you know, basic outline of the story here. So, quick rundown. Present day, like 2011. Desmond Miles is kidnapped by Abstergo Pharmaceuticals. I don't think by that point it was Abstergo Entertainment. And forced to relive his ancestors' lives. In this case, Altair Ibn Laha, I think is his full name. I don't know. So that they could try to find a piece of Eden that he came in contact with during the Crusade. Because it shows a map of the fucking precursor world where other pieces may be found. That's pretty much the overview of the first game. Cool. This also introduced the, I guess, ideals of the Assassins and the Templars, which has always been free will versus control. And I must say, for the majority of the Assassin's Creed games, you're led to believe that the Assassins are the morally superior ones, when in reality, the Assassins and the Templars are just two sides of the same coin. We'll get into that in a later video, but for right now, just take that to heart. The Assassins and Templars, while they want humanity to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Peaceable? Amenable? You know, not fuck each other over and kill everybody. They try to go about it in different ways. Right? Now, when this game released in 2007, there were quite a few games journalists. I know, that's still an occupation in this day and age, too. That thought the game repetitive in its missions. The fans, on the other hand, praised the game for what it was. What it did for the open world genre at that point. That you could have a world that felt alive. That you could have a world that felt huge and yet wasn't like an entire fucking continent. That you could have a city be an open world while still giving your players the sense of, holy shit, this place is huge. People loved it. Critics, you know how critics are. But what this did was it made it so that people would talk about it with their friends. I remember my friends talking to me about it when I was a kid there. And they pretty much talked me into talking my parents into getting the game for me. Which, you know, was one of the millions of copies that sold of the game. And with those millions of copies sold, it made Assassin's Creed, this unheard of game, a major franchise for Ubisoft. So pretty much overnight, Ubisoft became one of the tops of the gaming industry. And they took the formula that Assassin's Creed was in 2007 and decided they were going to hone that, to make that into a trilogy of games that was going to be the perfected form of what Assassin's Creed should be. Which led into Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, and Revelations. Along with this shift, wanting to go from Assassin's Creed to Assassin's Creed 2, it also cemented their change in focus from tight, linear, Prince of Persia style games to the open world games everybody knows Ubisoft for nowadays. Love them or hate them for it. This is where it came from, was Assassin's Creed. It inspired them going forward for all of their open world titles. Now this was the dawn of the open world Ubisoft era. A lot of people will just call it Ubislop, because it brought about the issues of repetitive game design and yearly releases without really innovating too much on what they already had going for them, which a lot of fans, myself included, got bored of. Not really sick of, but bored of, you know. Now the ending here, we'll just use as a little recap. Went from Prince of Persia, Assassins, to being the flagship of the Ubisoft IP. And it set the stage for what Ubisoft would later become, and currently is. But the games that actually took Ubisoft to that next level, that made people, quite frankly, fucking love almost everything they do. There are still die-hard fans that refuse to let anyone talk shit about Ubisoft, namely because of the games we're going to be covering next. Starting with Assassin's Creed 2. If you have any more insight into the Assassin's Creed games, or if I may have missed anything significant or had an oversight here or there, please let me know in the comments below. It's much appreciated. Like I said before, I'm just quickly looking into this stuff here as an old fan of Ubisoft from the beginning, just to see what happened in recent years. You know, when you can only really buy, you know, a couple of games a year, you try not to spoil yourself by looking at all of the games coming out. So you just stick with what's familiar, and what was familiar for me was Assassin's Creed. So, you know, it's kind of bittersweet to do these videos. So, if you have anything to add, or have any great stories and shit you want to share, go ahead and do so down in the comments. They're much appreciated. I try to read all of them when I can, and respond to all of them when I can. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'll see you in the next one.